Boeing did not fall because one airplane failed. That is the comfortable version of the story. The real story is worse. Boeing fell because a company built on engineering trust slowly became a company where trust had to compete with deadlines, margins, market pressure, outsourcing, stock performance, and the fear of losing to Airbus. And when trust becomes just one priority among many, it is no longer trust. For most companies, a crisis means losing customers. For Boeing, the crisis was deeper. Boeing sold something most businesses never have to sell: the belief that you can step inside a metal tube, rise into the sky, cross an ocean, and land safely because thousands of people you will never meet did their jobs perfectly. That was the Boeing product, not just airplanes. Confidence. For decades, Boeing was not simply an aircraft manufacturer. It was an American industrial symbol. Engineers spoke its language. Airlines depended on it, pilots trusted it. Governments relied on it. Passengers often never thought about it, and that was the point. The highest form of trust in aviation is invisibility. When everything works, nobody says thank you to the manufacturer. They just land. That was Boeing's magic. Then came a question that should have been impossible. Can we still trust Boeing? The answer did not collapse in one moment. It eroded, slowly. Through decisions that looked rational in isolation, through shortcuts that seemed manageable, through warnings that could be explained away, through a culture that increasingly measured success not only by what engineers built, but by what financial targets the company could hit. And the most important thing to understand is this: Boeing's fall was not the opposite of its success, it grew out of its success. Because Boeing became so important, airlines needed its planes. Because airlines needed its planes, regulators depended on its expertise. Because regulators depended on its expertise, Boeing received more responsibility in the certification process. Because investors expected performance, management pushed speed, efficiency, and cash. Because Airbus was rising, Boeing could not afford to lose time. Every piece made sense. Together, they created a system where the company that was supposed to be checked became too trusted to check properly. To understand how trust was destroyed, we have to understand why Boeing had so much trust in the first place. For much of the 20th century, Boeing represented the highest version of industrial engineering. This was the company behind aircraft that changed commercial aviation. Boeing did not just build machines. It built the infrastructure of modern air travel. The 707 helped bring the jet age to the public. The 747 became a symbol of global travel. The 737 became one of the most important aircraft families in history. Boeing's old identity was simple: engineering first. That did not mean the company was perfect. No giant institution is perfect. But Boeing's internal mythology was built around technical excellence. Engineers had status. Safety had authority. The company's reputation came from the belief that complicated problems would be solved by people who understood the machines better than anyone else. This is why the phrase, "If it's not Boeing, I'm not going," mattered. It was not just marketing. It was a cultural asset. People did not say that because they had studied aircraft certification. They said it because Boeing had become shorthand for safety. That kind of reputation takes decades to build. And once built, it becomes extremely valuable, but it also becomes dangerous. Because the more people trust you, the easier it becomes to believe that trust will always be there. The first major shift came long before the 737 MAX. It came when Boeing stopped thinking of itself only as an engineering company and increasingly became a financial performance company. The 1997 merger with McDonnell Douglas is often treated as a symbolic turning point. Boeing acquired McDonnell Douglas, but many critics argue that McDonnell Douglas's management style influenced the new Boeing more than Boeing's engineering culture influenced the merged company. The change was not instant. Factories did not suddenly forget how to build airplanes. Engineers did not suddenly stop caring. Boeing still produced important aircraft. It still employed world-class technical talent. It still had one of the most valuable backlogs in aviation. But incentives began to shift. Management became more focused on shareholder value. Cost discipline became more aggressive. Outsourcing became more important. Financial targets became more visible. The company moved its headquarters away from its main commercial airplane engineering base. That last detail mattered symbolically. The people making corporate decisions were becoming physically and culturally further away from the people building airplanes. In most industries, that would be a management choice. In aviation, it can become a safety issue. Because aircraft manufacturing is not software, not media, not consumer electronics, and not fast fashion. You cannot move fast and fix it later when millions of lives depend on the product working correctly the first time. An airplane is not only designed, it is certified, assembled, inspected, documented, maintained, and flown inside a vast system of trust. Every bolt matters, every sensor matters, every training decision matters, every assumption matters. And that is where Boeing's new culture began to collide with Boeing's old promise. The company still sold trust. But internally, trust was becoming more expensive to protect. Then Airbus changed the game. In 2010, Airbus launched the A320neo, a more fuel-efficient update to its narrow-body aircraft family. For airlines, fuel efficiency is not a small feature. Fuel is one of the largest operating costs in the airline business. A more efficient aircraft can save enormous money over time. Boeing had a choice. It could build an entirely new narrow-body aircraft, which would take years and cost billions, or it could update the 737 again. The second option was faster, cheaper, safer financially, easier to sell to airlines. And most importantly, it could be marketed as familiar. That word mattered, familiar. Boeing wanted the 737 MAX to feel close enough to older 737 models that airlines would not need expensive simulator training for pilots. That was a major selling point. Airlines do not only buy aircraft, they buy operating economics. If a new aircraft saves fuel, but also requires costly training, the business case becomes weaker. So the promise of the MAX was elegant. New fuel efficiency, old 737 familiarity. On paper, it was brilliant. But inside that promise was the hidden weakness. The 737 was an old platform being pushed into a new competitive era. To fit larger, more efficient engines on the 737, Boeing had to make design changes. Those changes affected how the aircraft handled in certain conditions. Boeing's answer included software called MCAS, the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System. MCAS was meant to help the aircraft handle more like previous 737s in specific situations. That sounds technical. But the business meaning was simple. The software helped preserve the story that the MAX was still just another 737. And that story was worth money. If the MAX could be sold as familiar, Boeing could compete with Airbus faster. Airlines could avoid major training costs. The production line could keep moving. Investors could see Boeing protecting its most important product family. Everyone had a reason to like the story. That is exactly why it was dangerous. The more valuable a story becomes, the harder it is to challenge. The red flags did not look like red flags to everyone at first. They looked like technical details, certification details, training details, internal disagreements, simulator questions, documentation choices. But later, those details would define the crisis. MCAS depended on sensor data. Under the original design, it could activate based on faulty input from a single angle of attack sensor. Many pilots were not initially given clear information about MCAS in the way the system later demanded. The key problem was not only software. It was the gap between what the aircraft had become and what the company wanted the aircraft to appear to be. Boeing needed the MAX to be new enough to compete, but not so new that it disrupted the economics of the 737 family. That tension sat at the center of the disaster. In October 2018, Lion Air Flight 6110 crashed after taking off from Jakarta. In March 2019, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 3002 crashed after taking off from Addis Ababa. Together, the two crashes killed 346 people. This is the point where the story must stay clear and careful. The crashes were not just tragic events. They were system failures, and after the second crash, the central question became unavoidable. How could a newly certified Boeing aircraft be involved in two similar disasters within 5 months? For Boeing, this was the moment where the old shield of trust broke. Before the crashes, Boeing's reputation helped explain away doubt. After the crashes, Boeing's reputation became the question. Investigations and reports began to reveal a pattern: production pressure, certification weaknesses, communication failures, flawed assumptions, and insufficient transparency. The House investigation later described the MAX crashes as the result of serious failures involving Boeing and the FAA. The issue was not just one bad line of code. It was not just one sensor. It was not just one team. It was a system that had allowed critical risk to remain hidden until it was too late. This is the difference between a technical failure and an institutional failure. A technical failure asks, what broke? An institutional failure asks, why did the system allow it to break? That second question was devastating for Boeing, because Boeing's entire brand was the system. The company had always asked the public to trust that its processes were stronger than any single mistake. But the MAX crisis suggested that the processes themselves had been weakened. The aircraft was grounded around the world. Deliveries stopped. Airlines were disrupted. Boeing took massive financial hits. Its reputation was damaged in a way money could not quickly repair. But the financial cost was not the deepest cost. The deeper cost was that people started reading about Boeing differently. A delay was no longer just a delay. A defect was no longer just a defect. A whistleblower complaint was no longer just noise. A quality issue was no longer isolated. A management statement was no longer automatically believed. Trust had reversed. Before the MAX crisis, Boeing received the benefit of the doubt. After it, doubt became the default, and Boeing's response made the problem worse. At first, the company and some officials emphasized pilot procedures and software updates. But as more information emerged, the public saw a company struggling to accept the full scale of the issue. That matters because in a trust crisis, the first product you sell is honesty. If people believe you are minimizing the problem, every future statement becomes weaker. Eventually, Boeing removed its CEO. The MAX was redesigned and recertified. After a long grounding, the aircraft returned to service. The company promised change. But returning an airplane to service is not the same as restoring an institution. The MAX crisis had exposed a deeper fear. Maybe Boeing's engineering culture had been degraded for years. Maybe the company had become too focused on financial performance. Maybe the regulator had become too dependent on the company. Maybe the old Boeing was gone. Those fears did not disappear when the MAX returned. They waited. And then on January 5, 2024, Alaska Airlines Flight 12022 took off from Portland. Minutes later, a door plug separated from the aircraft during flight. The plane returned safely. There were no fatalities, but the symbolism was catastrophic. Because this was not a hidden software system buried inside certification documents. This was visible. A piece of the airplane had separated in the sky. For the public, it confirmed the worst possible interpretation of Boeing's crisis. This was not just about the old MAX crashes, this was about manufacturing quality now. The NTSB later said the door plug was missing, the bolts needed to secure it. That detail was devastating because it was simple. You did not need to understand MCAS. You did not need to understand flight control software. You did not need to understand aircraft certification. You only needed to understand this. A critical part was supposed to be secured. It was not. That is why the Alaska incident became a new moment of truth. The MAX crisis had raised questions about design and certification. The Alaska incident raised questions about production and quality control. Together, they attacked Boeing's trust from both sides. Can Boeing design safely? Can Boeing build correctly? For an aircraft manufacturer, there are no more important questions. The FAA responded by increasing oversight and stopping Boeing from expanding MAX production until quality control concerns were addressed. That was not only a regulatory action, it was a public signal that Boeing could no longer be treated as a company whose internal systems automatically deserved full confidence. That is the collapse mechanism, not bankruptcy. Oversight replacing trust. When a company is trusted, it receives freedom. When trust is damaged, freedom is taken away. Boeing had once been trusted to help certify its own work through delegated authority inside the regulatory system. After the crisis, that model looked dangerous to many observers. The FAA had to become more visible. Congress had to ask harder questions. Airlines had to inspect more carefully. The public had to pay attention to aircraft models in a way passengers never wanted to. That is how trust gets destroyed. Not when one thing goes wrong, when every new problem becomes evidence of a pattern. And Boeing kept facing more problems. There were delivery delays, quality inspections, supplier issues, production disruptions, financial losses, labor tensions, defense program overruns, a damaged relationship with regulators, a damaged relationship with airlines, a damaged relationship with passengers. Even Boeing's supply chain told the same story. Spirit Aerosystems, a key supplier that made 737 fuselages, had once been part of Boeing before being spun off. Outsourcing and supplier dependence were supposed to reduce costs and improve efficiency. But over time, they also created new coordination and quality control challenges. This is the hidden cost of financial efficiency. When everything works, outsourcing looks smart. When quality fails, outsourcing becomes another layer where responsibility can blur. Who built the part? Who inspected it? Who documented the work? Who removed it? Who reinstalled it? Who signed off? Who noticed? Who should have noticed? In aviation, those questions cannot be vague. They must have answers. Boeing eventually moved to bring Spirit Aerosystems back under its control, framing the deal around safety, quality, and production stability. That move itself revealed the lesson. The company had to rebuild control over a system that earlier generations of management had helped fragment. This is what institutional decay looks like. It is not always dramatic. It can look like a supplier contract, a moved headquarters, a missed memo, a pressure to avoid simulator training, a production schedule that cannot slip, a quality warning that gets treated as an obstacle, a regulator that lacks enough independent capacity, a board that rewards financial performance more visibly than engineering caution. No single decision explains everything, but together they change what the institution protects. And that is the core of the Boeing story. Boeing did not stop having engineers. It did not stop having talented people. It did not stop building airplanes. The tragedy is almost the opposite. Many people inside Boeing did care. Many workers, engineers, inspectors, and pilots understood the stakes. Many raised concerns. Many wanted the company to live up to its old standard. But culture is not what an institution says it values. Culture is what wins when values collide. When safety and schedule collide, what wins? When engineering caution and market pressure collide, what wins? When transparency and legal risk collide, what wins? When a supplier delay and a delivery target collide, what wins? When a pilot training concern and an airline sales pitch collide, what wins? For Boeing, too many people began to believe the wrong things were winning. That belief became the real crisis. The legal consequences reinforced it. In 2021, Boeing entered into a deferred prosecution agreement with the U.S. Department of Justice over the 737 MAX matter. In 2024, the DOJ said Boeing had breached that agreement. A proposed guilty plea followed, but the court rejected that version. In 2025, Boeing entered into a non-prosecution agreement that included a criminal monetary penalty, additional compensation for crash victim families, compliance obligations, and an independent consultant. The legal details are complex, but the public meaning was simple. The government was no longer treating Boeing's problem as only an engineering mistake. It was a question of accountability, compliance, and trust. And still, Boeing did not disappear. That is another reason this story matters. Boeing is not a dead company. It remains enormous. It has a massive backlog. Airlines still need aircraft. The world still needs two major commercial airplane manufacturers. Airbus cannot replace Boeing overnight. The US government still depends on Boeing for defense and space programs. Thousands of suppliers and workers depend on Boeing's recovery. This is not a story where the market simply walks away. That makes the situation more complicated. When a normal brand loses trust, customers can choose another brand. When Boeing loses trust, the world still has to decide how to fly. That is why Boeing's crisis is bigger than Boeing. It is a crisis of a system that became dependent on a company whose internal culture was under question. Airlines needed Boeing. Regulators needed Boeing's technical knowledge. Suppliers needed Boeing's orders. Investors needed Boeing's cash flow. Governments needed Boeing's industrial capacity. Passengers needed the entire system to work. Too many people needed Boeing to be trustworthy, and that made it harder to confront the possibility that trust had already been damaged. This is why the fall of Boeing is not only about corporate greed. That would be too easy. Greed alone does not explain it. The better explanation is incentive drift. Over time, a company built for engineering excellence absorbed incentives from Wall Street, competition, outsourcing, production speed, regulatory delegation, and executive performance metrics. Each incentive could be defended. Each had a business logic. Each helped Boeing compete. But together, they made the company less like the Boeing people thought they knew. The old Boeing asked, "What does the aircraft need?" The new Boeing, too, often seemed to ask, "What does the market need us to deliver?" That difference can be invisible for years, until the moment it is not. The human price is what makes this story impossible to reduce to numbers. The families of 346 people lost loved ones in the MAX crashes. Passengers on later flights had to wonder whether the system protecting them was as strong as they had believed. Airline workers had to answer questions they did not create. Engineers and factory workers saw the name of their company become associated with failure, even when many of them had spent their careers trying to prevent exactly that. Whistleblowers and quality inspectors carried concerns into a system that did not always make raising concerns easy, and the public lost something too. A kind of innocence about flight. Most passengers do not want to know the aircraft model. They do not want to read about inspection procedures. They do not want to understand delegated certification. They do not want to wonder whether a company's internal culture is strong enough. They want to board. They want to trust. They want the system to be boring. Boeing made aviation feel boring for decades. That was the achievement. The fall of Boeing is that flying on a Boeing aircraft became, for many people, something to think about. That is the opposite of trust. Now Boeing is trying to rebuild. New leadership has promised cultural change. Regulators are watching more closely. Production has been slowed and inspected. Spirit Aerosystems has been brought back into Boeing. The company has spoken about safety and quality as central priorities. Financial results have improved from the worst periods. Deliveries have recovered. The backlog remains huge. But the hardest repair is not mechanical, it is institutional. Boeing can fix a software system. It can inspect a door plug. It can revise procedures. It can change executives. It can buy back a supplier. It can pay penalties. It can publish safety plans. But trust does not return because a company announces that it should. Trust returns when the next 1,000 decisions prove that the old incentives no longer control the institution. That means allowing delays when delays are necessary. It means treating inspectors as protection, not friction. It means giving engineers power when the spreadsheet wants speed. It means making quality failures visible before they become public crises. It means accepting that in aviation, efficiency is never the highest value. Safety is not as a slogan, as a decision rule. That is the final lesson of Boeing. The company's old greatness came from a simple belief: if the engineering is right, the business will follow. Its decline came when too many parts of the institution behaved as if the business could pressure the engineering and still keep the same trust. But trust in aviation is not a brand asset you can spend forever. It is a daily audit. Every aircraft, every bolt, every sensor, every line of code, every inspection, every certification document, every uncomfortable internal warning, all of it either deposits into trust or withdraws from it. For decades, Boeing had a huge balance of trust. The MAX crashes made a massive withdrawal. The Alaska door plug incident made another. The investigations, legal cases, and production problems made the public look at the account again. And that is when people realized the balance was not infinite. Boeing's fall is not the end of Boeing. It is the end of the assumption that Boeing automatically deserves belief. That is what was destroyed. Not the factories. Not the backlog. Not the aircraft programs. Not even the future of the company. What was destroyed was the old silence. The silence of passengers who never wondered. The silence of regulators who could rely on reputation. The silence of airlines that trusted delivery promises. The silence of investors who treated engineering risk as a footnote. The silence around a culture that had changed before the public noticed. Boeing can still rebuild. But it cannot rebuild by asking the world to remember what it used to be. It has to become trustworthy again in the only way that matters: decision by decision, inspection by inspection, aircraft by aircraft, until flying Boeing becomes boring again. Because in aviation, boring is not a weakness. Boring means the system worked. And Boeing's greatest tragedy is that the company once understood that better than anyone.